In the dust-dry, wind-scoured summer of 1977, on a hardpan quarter section high on the New Mexico plateau, a 58-year-old widow named Odessa Faye Marsh had dug her entire vegetable garden down into a grid of shallow sunken squares that the whole of the county had already decided was the work of a woman gone soft in the head. And by the time the men at the co-op counter in the little plateau town had finished their morning coffee, they had a name for it. They called it her sandbox. They called it the checkerboard. They laughed about it 2 full growing seasons running, right up until the driest, windiest year the high country had seen since the Dust Bowl came down out of a brassy sky and blew every flat-plowed truck patch in the county to bare drifting dirt, every garden but hers. Hers lay deep green and wet and heavy with fruit, the only living garden for 30 miles in any direction. She had not gone soft at all. She had gardened out of a thing written down in a dead woman's hand, a thing that not one of those laughing men had ever had the patience or the humility to read. She was 58 years old that summer, a lean, sun-weathered woman with deep squint lines cut at the corners of her eyes and a spray of freckled sunburn scattered across her cheekbones that 30 summers of that hard, bright country had never quite worn away. Her eyes were a faded blue, the pale washed color of a noon sky over dry ground. Her hair had gone the sandy gray of old rope, and she wore it knotted up loose and coming down in strands under a pale straw hat gone soft and sweat-stained, its brim frayed to threads at the edge. Her shirt was a thin chambray with the sleeves shoved up past her elbows over forearms browned and roped hard by every task that ground had ever asked of her. She stood at the edge of one of her sunken squares on the worst morning of the drought, both dirt-dusted hands cupped under the weight of a single deep-grained striped melon she had just lifted from the wet, dark soil. A smear of damp earth still clinging to its rind, and beyond her sagging wire fence the whole country ran pale and cracked and blowing to the horizon. She did not gloat. That is the first thing you have to understand about Odessa Marsh, because every other thing in this story turns on it. She had every reason in the world that summer to carry that melon up to the fence line and set it down in front of the men who had laughed and say one hard, true sentence, and she never did. She only worked her squares and dippered her water, and let the dry year do the talking for her. If you have ever kept faith with a way of doing a thing that the whole world had already written off as foolishness, a method, a piece of ground, an old habit handed down from someone who is gone, then you already understand why this story is being told, and you already understand her. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. 2 springs before that terrible dry summer, Odessa Marsh had gone out into her flat, plowed, perfectly ordinary vegetable garden with a hand spade and a length of knotted string and a wooden stake, and she had begun, to the bafflement of everyone who drove past her place on the plateau road, to dig it all down into holes. Not holes exactly, squares, shallow square beds, each one about the size of a wagon bed and sunk perhaps a hand's depth below the level of the ground, and each one ringed all the way around by a low wall of earth she packed by hand a berm, a little levee of soil no higher than her shin, built up firm and smooth so the square sat down inside it like water held in a cupped palm. She laid them out in a grid, straight rows of sunken cells marching back across the yard one behind the other, each square divided from the next by its shared earthen wall, so that the whole garden, seen from the plateau road, looked for all the world like the face of a waffle iron pressed down into the dirt. It took her the better part of 2 springs of hand labor to dig and burn the whole of it, cell by cell, kneeling in the dirt with a spade, while the flat, easy world plowed straight furrows all around her. The plateau country did not know what to make of it. A proper garden, everyone on that ground knew from their fathers and their fathers before them, was plowed flat and level and clean, the rows raised, if anything, so the water would drain and the plant would not sit wet and rot. That was simply how it was done, how it had always been done, how any sensible person did it. And here was the marsh widow doing the exact backward of it, digging her beds down instead of raising them up, walling each one so no drop of water could ever run off, making a garden that looked like it had been built to catch and hold the very thing every other gardener in the county was working to shed. It made no sense to a single one of them. So they did what a hard place always does with a thing it cannot understand. They laughed and they gave it a name. They called it her sandbox first. Down at the co-op, a fellow named Hollis Deacon sang it loud across the counter with a sack of seed corn on his shoulder that the marsh woman had quit gardening and taken up making mud pies. That she'd dug herself a sandbox out there like a child. It got a laugh, and a thing that gets a laugh in a small, dry county gets said again, and by the second telling it was the checkerboard, and by the end of that first spring every soul on the plateau knew the marsh place by its checkerboard garden and its checkerboard woman, and the name was said kindly, mostly, by people who meant her no real harm and had simply decided that a woman 10 years widowed and alone on hard ground had finally, understandably, gone a little strange. That is the cruelest thing a country can do to a person, to write her off, not with any hatred, but with a fond, pitying laugh over a coffee cup. Odessa Marsh heard all of it. She let it lie where it fell, and she went on digging her squares. Her name was Odessa Fay Marsh, and she had worked that quarter section alone for the 10 years since her husband died, and she had worked it beside him for near 30 years before that, and she did not turn her head toward the plateau road when the trucks slowed to look. She dug her squares by the string and the stake, and she wrote the shape of them and the size of them in a small book with a pencil stub, and she waited on the season, as her husband's grandmother had taught her a garden must always be waited on. Because what not one of them knew what Hollis Deacon, with his straight, clean furrows and his loud coffee counter laugh, would not learn until the worst August of his life was that Odessa Marsh had not invented her sandbox out of a widow's loneliness at all. She had built it out of a book, and the book was 80 years old, and the hand that had filled it was 80 years gone into the dry plateau ground, and every square she dug was drawn there on its pages in a careful, patient, foreign-looking hand that not one man at that co-op counter had the humility to imagine. The book had belonged to her husband's grandmother, an old Pueblo woman the family had only ever called Grandmother Paloma, though that had not been her true name in her own tongue, and she had gardened the dry mesa the Sunken way for 80 years of her long life, and had not once, across all those years, gone hungry in a dry year. It was a hand-sewn book, bound in a cracked oilcloth cover gone the brown of old walnut hulls, its pages soft as cloth from 4 generations of handling. And Grandmother Paloma had kept it in a mix of pencil and careful ink across most of her long life. It was not a diary. It was a working gardener's book, the depth to dig a cell and the height to raise its wall, which corner of a square to plant the beans, and which the melons, so the tall, shaded the low, the day the first rain usually came off the mountains, and the day it usually quit, which plants would carry a dry spell, and which would fold, a whole 80 years of a desert woman's dry land knowledge set down square by square. And drawn across 2 facing pages near the middle of the book, in an old sure hand was a diagram of the waffle grid itself, the sunken cells, the packed berms, arrows showing where the water was meant to sit and soak. And beneath it a single line of the old woman's writing that Odessa had read so many times the page had gone soft and gray at that corner. The water does not run away from a house it cannot leave. Odessa Marsh did not yet know, those first 2 springs, everything that line was going to come to mean. She knew only that the old woman had fed a family off dry mesa ground for 80 years by those words, and had never once in all that time been the fool the county was now making of her. So she dug the garden the book would have dug, and she planted it the way the book laid out. And she waited to be shown the rest of it by a season hard enough to prove it. The work of it was the least glamorous labor a person can do, and there was a great deal of it. A flat garden a man plows in a morning, Odessa's garden she built 1 square at a time with a hand spade over 2 long springs, kneeling in the dirt, cutting each cell down to the depth the book gave, and then packing its walls firm with the flat of the blade and the heel of her hand so they would hold and not slump in the first hard rain. And then, once the squares were dug and the seed was in, came the watering, and the watering was the true grind of the thing, because Odessa Marsh had no windmill and no drilled well and no pump. She had a shallow hand-dug cistern her husband had lined with stone, fed by what little rain the roof of the house and the shed threw off, and she had a wooden yoke and 2 buckets and a long-handled tin dipper. And she watered that garden as Grandmother Paloma had watered the mesa cell by Sunken cell, on her knees, dipping the water down low against the roots of the plants inside each. Walled square, so that not 1 drop of it ran off across the ground and was lost. A flat garden you water with a hose across the whole of it, and half of what you pour runs away downhill and steams off the hot top of the ground before it ever reaches a root. Odessa poured her water into 100 little walled cisterns, 1 dipper at a time, down where the plant was drinking, and the earthen walls held every drop of it exactly where she put it. It was slow. It was back-breaking. It was, to any man who drove past and saw a grown woman crawling down a grid of holes with a dipper, the plain proof that she had lost her sense. She did it every morning in the cool and again in the evening, and she watched the water against a mark cut in its stone rim, and that mark held longer than any flat gardener in the county could have believed, because a garden that hoards its water needs so much less of it. To the laughing men in town, it was a sandbox. To Odessa Marsh it was 100 small green rooms, each one holding its own damp, cool air down below the wind, and she knew every square in it as you know the rooms of a house which cell caught the first sun, which one the melons had taken a liking to, which corner the wind still found. She never once treated it like the joke the county had decided it was, because there was a man watching Odessa Marsh's garden, and he was not laughing at it. He was measuring it. His name was Ferris Coyle, and he ran the big flat section that cornered hers on the west, and he had wanted her quarter section for longer than anyone could say. It was not the garden. It was the deed, a hardpan quarter with an old water right and a hand-dug cistern and a stone-lined draw. Sitting in the middle of ground, Ferris Coyle meant one day to hold all of. He was a patient man and a smiling one, and the most dangerous thing in that whole dry country wore exactly that face, the neighbor who comes by friendly and often, who admires your fence and asks after your health and lets it be known gently, kindly, over years, that a woman alone on hard ground would surely be better off letting a man who could work it right take the burden off her. He had been saying versions of that to Odessa for nearly 10 years. He said it again that second spring, leaning on her gate with his hat pushed back and his voice easy. A woman your age, he told her, kind as Sunday, has got no business out here on her knees in the dirt digging holes. I'd take the whole quarter off your hands at a fair price and let you keep the house to live out your days in. Do it as a neighbor. She thanked Ferris Coyle for his concern, and she sold him not 1 foot of her ground. Ferris Coyle had a wife named Winona, who did not smile as her husband smiled, and there was a thing that passed between them across their own supper table more than one evening, that spring, the wife looking at the husband a long, steady moment over the plates and saying only the one word. Ferris. Just his name laid down flat, and he would go quiet under it, quiet as a man goes when a decent woman shames him with a single word and they both know exactly what he is circling. Then a week later, he would be back at Odessa's gate, smiling, patient, asking after her health and admiring her fence. The country went on laughing, and the seasons turned. And Odessa Marsh went on digging and planting and dipping her water down into her 100-walled squares, and a thing that was going to matter more than any of it, more than the laughter, more than Ferris Coyle's patient smile, more than the young extension man who was coming with his clipboard and his certainty, was a thing not one soul in that county was watching for. It was moving already, slow and dry and enormous, far out over the mountains and the plains. The dry year had begun, and it did not know it yet. But before the dry year there came a wet one, and the wet one nearly finished her. The spring before the drought came in, soft and false and generous, a run of easy soaking rains off the mountains that greened the whole plateau up overnight and made the flat gardeners of the county look like the wisest men who ever pushed a plow. There was so much rain that year that a flat plowed patch drank it and threw the rest off downhill and hardly noticed. And Hollis Deacon's long, straight rows came up thick and lush and dark, and the whole county looked at the flat garden standing green with almost no work at all, and then looked out at the marsh woman still crawling down her sunken squares with a dipper as if the sky might quit at any hour, and the laughing that sprang got louder than it had ever been. There is no harder thing in this life than to hold to a slow, true, difficult way through the weeks when the easy way is winning in plain sight of everyone. A wet spring is exactly the season a sunken garden looks the most foolish, because in a wet spring the whole point of it, the holding, the hoarding, the not letting go of every drop, is a solution to a problem nobody has. The squares held water they did not need. A cell or two down at the low end even stood too wet, and Odessa had to break a berm and let one drain, and Hollis Deacon drove past and saw her bailing water out of her own garden with a bucket and told that one at the co-op for a week. And then, into the middle of that false green spring, the county agent came. He was a young man named Prentice Vandaley, out of the extension office down in the valley, earnest and college-schooled and entirely certain of everything he had been taught. And he came up onto the plateau with a clipboard and a soil auger and a book of tables in the cab of his truck, making his rounds of the county's gardens and fields, advising and recording. He walked Odessa's checkerboard garden with a frown deepening on his young face, and he measured the depth of her cells and the height of her berms and wrote it all down. And he augured a core of her soil and rubbed it between his fingers, and he did not like any of what he found, because not one line of it matched anything in his book of tables. Her beds were sunk where the modern method raised them. Her walls trapped water the modern method was engineered to drain. Her yields, cell by cell, were smaller than a flat irrigated row would throw in a wet year, and her whole strange hand-built grid was, by every standard the Extension Service kept, a primitive and low-yielding way to garden that no trained man could recommend. He stood at her kitchen table that afternoon, turning his hat brim slow between his young fingers, and told her, not unkindly, the thing the whole county already believed. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I'll tell you plainly. This method of yours is old, and it's backward, and it can't ever pay. Sunken beds waterlog the root and breed rot, and the labor to build them is out of all proportion to what they yield. The service would advise anyone in your position to level the whole garden flat this fall, plow it clean, and put in proper raised rows on modern spacing. Bring yourself into this century. That grid out there is a museum piece." He wrote his finding on his form in a firm young hand that the Marsh garden employed a primitive, low-yield sunken method, and that the operator should be advised to level and modernize, and he left a copy of it on her kitchen table, and he drove his truck back down off the plateau, entirely certain he had done a widow a kindness. That evening was the closest Odessa Faye Marsh ever came to plowing her squares flat with her own hands. She sat at her kitchen table a long time with the young man's report in front of her and Grandmother Paloma's cracked oilcloth book beside it, and outside the window the sky was still soft and generous with that false, wet spring green everywhere she looked. Every flat garden in the county thriving without half the labor she poured out on her knees every single dawn and dusk. She was tired, as only 10 years of being laughed at can make a person tired. Tired down under the ribs in the place where the pride lives. And here at last was a trained man from the government with a clipboard and a book of tables telling her in plain words what the county had only ever muttered behind a coffee cup, that she was a fool. That the old woman had been a fool. That the sensible thing, the modern thing, the thing that would let her finally rest and finally stop being the county joke, was to take a plow to the whole 80-year-old grid and level it clean. There was a shovel leaning by the door. She looked at it a long while that evening. The false rain came down soft and easy on the roof, watering the flat gardens of men who had never in their lives had to think about where the next drop was coming from. And she came within a single breath of walking out into the dusk and breaking down the first berm with her boot. Then she did not. She pulled the oilcloth book to her across the table instead, and she turned to the two facing pages where the old sure hand had drawn the sunken grid. And she read the one line beneath it one more time: "The water does not run away from a house it cannot leave," and she turned past it to a clean page. And she picked up the pencil stub, and she wrote the day's date and the day's rain and the mark on the cistern rim, exactly as Grandmother Paloma had written it for 80 years and her mother before her, because that is how a person keeps faith with a thing on the very night she most wants to quit it. She does not argue with the doubt. She does the small true chore the doubt is telling her to abandon, one more time, in the dark. She banked the drained cell's berm back up in the last of the light, and she went to bed, and she did not take the plow to her garden. What the young agent with his clipboard had not thought to write down, what Hollis Deacon, laughing at the co-op, had never once thought to reckon, what not one flat gardener standing in that soft green false spring had the imagination to ask, was a single plain question. It was this: what happens to all of this? The flat rose, the easy green, the water thrown off downhill without a care on the day the rain simply does not come? Because the rain was going to stop. It had already, far off over the mountains, begun to stop. And a garden built for a wet year and a garden built for a dry one look exactly alike, right up until the sky closes, and then they look like nothing else on earth. The dry year came on slow at first, as the worst of them always do. The last good rain fell in the third week of May, and then the sky over the plateau simply closed, and it stayed closed. June came dry. The soft, false green of spring went first to a tired yellow and then to brown, and the wind stood up out of the southwest and did not lie back down, a hot, dry, ceaseless wind that came across the plains with a low, steady roar in it day and night. The killing ground wind that plateau people feared more than they feared the drought itself, because a still drought only bakes the ground while a windy one strips it. The wells began to drop. Ferris Coil's big pump on the flat section sucked air by the middle of July and had to be nursed. Hollis Deacon's straight, lush rose, the ones everyone had admired all spring, curled and paled and then browned from the edges in, because a flat garden in a hard wind is a garden with its throat open to the sky. Every drop a man carried to it ran off the level ground before it soaked, and what did soak was pulled straight back out of the bare open dirt by that hot moving air faster than a root could ever drink it. By the first week of August, the flat truck patches of the county were not gardens anymore. They were dust. The wind picked the dried topsoil up off the plowed ground and carried it, and the plateau went brown in the air as well as on the ground, a low brown haze standing over every leveled field for 30 miles, the loose dirt of 100 proper modern gardens drifting against the fence wires like dirty snow. It was the driest, windiest year the high country had known in 40 years, and it took the leveled truck patches all at once and completely, as ruin comes to a whole country in a single season, and it did not leave enough behind to feed a family. It did not take Odessa Marsh's garden. There is a mourning in this story that every soul who lived on that plateau carried to the ends of their lives. And it is the morning Hollis Deacon drove out the plateau road in the brown wind to look at his own ruined patch, and looked instead out of the corner of his eye across the Marsh woman's sagging wire fence. On his side of that fence the ground ran pale and cracked and drifting, his own leveled garden blown down to bare hardpan. Curled brown stalks of what had been beans and squash lying flat and dead in the moving dust, and the same dead pale waste running on past his place to the horizon in every direction the eye could reach. And on the other side of that one wire fence, down inside her 100 sunken walled squares, out of the reach of the wind that was scouring the whole rest of the world to bone there, was green. Deep, waxy, impossible green. Bean vine and squash leaf spilling thick over the packed earthen berms, chili standing dark and heavy, melon foliage sprawling wet across the cool sunk soil, and the black damp earth of the cells showing moist between the leaves as though it had rained on that 1/4 acre and nowhere else in New Mexico. It was the only living garden for 30 miles in any direction, and it lay there deep and green and dripping in the middle of a brown dead country, on the far side of one wire fence, and Hollis Deacon stopped his truck in the road and got out and stood in the hot wind and looked at it for a long time and did not say one word. Here is the thing the book had known for 80 years, the thing not one man of them had had the patience to read, the reason her sandbox lived while their proper gardens blew away. A flat garden fights the dry wind and loses on 3 fronts at once, and a sunken waffle garden wins on all 3. First, the water. When Odessa dippered water down into a walled cell, the earthen berm ringing that cell held it exactly where she poured it. It could not run off across the ground and be lost, because there was no downhill for it inside a square that was dug below the level of the world. Every drop she carried, and every rare drop the sky gave, sank straight down into the root zone of the plant standing in that cell and stayed there. A flat bed, plowed level or raised, sheds water. A sunken cell is a little cistern, and Odessa's garden was 100 small cisterns holding their water down at the root where the wind could not reach it. Second, that same wind. The berms, those low walls the young agent had called primitive. The walls the county had laughed at for 2 years stood up all around each sunken bed and broke the killing ground wind before it could reach the plants down inside. The plants grew in the still, dead calm air at the bottom of their walled squares, sheltered as if by 100 tiny windbreaks, while out on the flat ground the wind moved freely across every leaf and pulled the moisture straight out of it and out of the open dirt. And third, the shade and the cool. The walls of each cell threw a shadow down into the sunk bed through the low morning and late evening sun, and the sunk soil, held below the hot scouring surface of the ground, stayed cool and dark and damp all through the worst heat of the day, so that what water was there did not steam away, but sat, patient and held, waiting for the roots. Water held instead of run off. Wind broken instead of let through. Ground kept cool and damp instead of baked and stripped. It was not luck. It was not a miracle. And it was not the widow's stubbornness rewarded. It was geometry. It was 80 years of a desert woman's careful reckoning drawn on 2 facing pages in an old sure hand, doing in a dust year exactly the thing it had been built across a lifetime to do. Geometry and 80 years of patience and a garden the water could not leave. Odessa Marsh watered her 100 green rooms all through that dust August the same slow way she always had. On her knees at dawn and dusk with the tin dipper out of a stone cistern that held far longer than any flat gardener could have believed, precisely because a garden that keeps its water needs so little of it. And along her fence the neighbors' ruined ground blew brown, and the wells dropped, and the flat gardens of the county lay dead in the drifting dirt, and Odessa Marsh did not once walk up to the fence and say the hard, true sentence she had every right in the world to say. She did not gloat. The dry year did all of her talking, and it talked for 30 miles. The first person to cross her fence was not one of the laughing men. It was a boy Ferris Coyle's own son, a lean, quiet boy of about 16 named Emmett, who came up the Plateau Road on foot one evening late in that dead August and stood a long while at the marsh gate before he found the nerve to open it. Odessa was down in the squares with the dipper. The boy came across the yard to where the green began, twisting a battered cap in both fists, and he stood at the berm of the nearest cell, looking down at the wet, dark soil and the heavy vine as if he were looking at water in the desert, which he was. "My father didn't send me," the boy said finally. "He doesn't know I'm here." He swallowed. "My mother's garden is gone. Everything's gone." Hours and everybody's. He looked up at her. She's near out of what we put by. I came to ask, could you show her how you did it? The squares. Before next spring. Could you teach my mother the squares? Odessa Marsh looked at Ferris Coyle's boy standing at the edge of her green garden with that cap wrung to a rag in his fists, and whatever she might have felt about the father, she set it down. She climbed up out of the cell, and she wiped her hands on the thighs of her chambray, and she said the only thing there was to say. Send her up, she said. Send anybody up who wants to learn it. I'll show whoever comes. And she did. She showed the boy's mother first Winona Coyle came up the Plateau Road within the week, and Odessa took her down the grid cell by cell, with the oilcloth book open in her hands, showing her the depth to dig and the height to pack the walls and how the water sat, and as they knelt together at the fourth square, the older woman said the only piece of it that ever truly mattered. You are not building a garden, she told Winona Coyle, low and certain, the black wet soil in her open hand. You are building 100 little houses the water is not allowed to leave. Dig them deep, wall them tight. Then the dry year works for you instead of against you. And Winona Coyle went home and dug her first 4 squares that fall with her son. Then others came, because a green garden standing alone in a brown dead county is an argument no amount of coffee counter laughter can answer, and one at a time, hats in hand, the flat gardeners of the plateau came up the marsh road and stood along that green fence line and asked the checkerboard woman to teach them the checkerboard. She taught every one of them. She never once made a single one of them say out loud that they had been wrong. The garden had already said it. If you have made it this far into a story about a widow and a garden of holes, then you are the kind of person this whole channel is built for. And you already know how it feels to be the last one still doing a thing the right slow way after everyone else has quit it, so stay with her. Because the ending is the part that matters most. Ferris Coyle never did come up the road himself. A patient predator does not know how to walk to a fence with his hat in his hands. It is not in him. But something in him went quiet that dust year, and stayed quiet. And he never again stood at Odessa Marsh's gate asking to take the burden of her ground off a woman alone. Because the county had seen now which of the two of them had actually known how to hold that ground, and it was surely not the man whose big pump sucked air in July. He let her be. His wife and his son kept their squares, and their squares fed them, and that was a kind of reckoning too, the quiet kind, the kind that does not need a single word said across a fence. And the young agent came back. Prentice Van Deely drove up onto the plateau again that fall, out of the same valley office, and this time he did not carry his clipboard the same way. He had spent the dust year watching every flat modern garden in his district blow away exactly as the widow's primitive sunken one had not, and he was young enough and honest enough to let it teach him. He walked Odessa's grid again, slower this time, and he stood a long moment at the first green cell before he said what he had driven up the plateau to say. I wrote in my report that you should level this and plow it flat, he said. I want to tell you to your face that I was wrong. Every garden I signed off on that spring is gone, and yours is the only one still feeding a family. I don't understand yet how it works. I would like you to teach me. It is not mine to teach, she told him. It belonged to an old woman who is gone, and it is all written down in her hand. Sit at my table, and I will read it to you as she once read it to me. And she opened Grandmother Paloma's oilcloth book on the berm and showed him the 2 facing pages and the old sure hand and the one line beneath the diagram. And Prentice Van Daly took his findings back down to the valley, and he wrote them up, not the old form that had called her method primitive and low yield, but a new one. A proper documented write-up of the Sunken waffle garden has a traditional dry land water conserving method proven through the worst drought since the Dust Bowl. He wrote that the sunken bermed cell captured and held both rainfall and applied water at the root, broke the desiccating ground wind, and maintained soil moisture and coolness through extreme heat. And he recommended it to the district for dry country. And at the top of the file, where the service kept the name of a method source, he did not write the widow's name, and he did not write his own. He wrote the name the widow gave him, that this was the waffle garden method of the Pueblo people of the Mesa, kept 80 years by the woman the Marsh family had called Grandmother Paloma, and set down in her own hand in a book still kept and still worked on the plateau. He named the old dead woman into the permanent record of the county that had laughed at her granddaughter for keeping faith with her. That is what canonization looks like in a story like this one, not a trophy. A name written correctly into a file that will outlast everyone who ever laughed. The squares spread down the plateau after that dust year as all true things spread slowly, by hand, one neighbor teaching the next. Within a few seasons, there were sunken waffle gardens dug in behind a dozen plateau houses that had only ever plowed flat before, and in a dry summer you could tell them from the road by the green, and nobody on that ground called them sandboxes anymore. They called them waffle gardens, and the older ones among them, when a young person asked where the notion had come from, would say it had come up from the Marsh place, from the widow and the old book, from a way of gardening the desert that was a great deal older than any of them, and had only been waiting all along for a year hard enough to prove it. Odessa Fay Marsh gardened her squares for many more years, and she never gloated, not once, not to the end of her life. When people came to learn, she taught them, and when they thanked her, she pointed them past herself to the old woman and the old book, because she understood a thing the laughing men had needed a whole dust year to learn, that she had not been clever. She had only been humble enough to read what a wiser woman had already written down, and stubborn enough to keep faith with it on the night she most wanted to quit. And there is a last picture in this story, and it is the one to hold. On a shelf in the Marsh kitchen, above the table where a widow once sat within a breath of taking a plow to 80 years of knowledge, and chose instead to write in the dark, there sat the cracked oilcloth book, brown as old walnut hulls, soft as cloth from 4 generations of hands. And on a clean page near the back, in a hand that was not the old sure Pueblo hand, but the plainer pencil of the woman who had kept the faith, was written the record of the dust year of 1977, the day the last rain fell, the day the wind rose and would not lie back down, the mark on the cistern rim that barely moved all through that dead August, and the single line, entered beneath 80 years of the old woman's entries that the squares had held when every flat garden in the county blew away. The book went back on the shelf. It is, for all anyone knows, still on a shelf somewhere on that plateau, still being written in, the dust year of 1977 set down in pencil beneath the oldest entries of a woman 80 years gone, waiting, patient as it has always been, for whoever comes next and has the patience to read it. Because there is one of these stories in every dry county in America, a person the whole world wrote off with a fond and pitying laugh, keeping faith with a thing handed down from someone gone, until the hard year came and prove them right in front of everyone. So tell me this before you go. When your own hard year comes, and it will, would you rather be the one who plowed flat and easy with everybody else and blew away when the wind stood up, or the one who kneels in the dirt and digs the harder, slower, wiser way, and is the only green thing standing for 30 miles when it finally matters? Leave your answer in the comments and tell me where you're watching from tonight.